It's been 12 years. That was the last time that Fire Pro truly walked the earth, when Fire Pro Returns came out for the PS2. Even back then everyone was saying that it was going to be the last one out, one final curtain. It even became one of the few entries in the series to get a release outside of Japan. What to say about it? It's one of my favourite games ever, certainly one of my most played games ever. As old as the game might have been, it was still easily the best wrestling game out there. No contest, no chance of a WWE 2K game even hoping to compete. And if it had been the last entry in the series, well, I wouldn't have minded. But now it's 2017, and all of a sudden, Fire Pro Wrestling is back. More than that, it's on PC. It'll be on PS4 soon too. The announcement of a new Fire Pro knocked me sideways, that's for sure. And now it's here. At least it's in Steam Early Access. And if you thought that I was just going to ignore it, you're so wrong. So, Fire Pro Wrestling World. Where to start? Well, perhaps we should look at just what's made the king get up off of his throne and return to show everybody else just what's what. Being a largely Japanese series, it would be silly not to start with a history lesson. The first Fire Pro came out all the way back in 1989 for the PC Engine courtesy of Human Entertainment, Fire Pro Wrestling Combination Tag, featuring just 16 wrestlers. Soon it transferred to the SNES, which is where it would experience its most successful period. As we hit the early 90s, wrestling in Japan goes through a big boom time, and Fire Pro is a big benefit of that. While the game has rarely ever featured any official licenses, the game becomes known for a roster of unofficial likenesses consisting of just about anyone who's a name in the Japanese scene, and even beyond, with a few Americans showing up. Said likenesses have the looks and the moves of their real-life counterparts, and they wrestle pretty damn well to boot. For the majority of its time, the driving force behind the series was one man, Masato Masuda, the creator of Fire Pro. Masuda actually started out on another, altogether more famous wrestling game. He designed Pro Wrestling for the NES. Starman, Giant Panther and King Korn Khan are indeed Fire Pro's direct ancestors, and the studio who worked on that game, Try, would eventually become Human. He also gave a break to a young designer by the name of Goichi Suda, who famously worked on the storyline for 1994's Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, a game in which King Slender, Fire Pro's version of Ric Flair, kills your coach and your brother, you split up with your wife, and then after beating Slender for the title you find that life is empty without all your friends and family, and you commit suicide. And thus the legend of Suda 51 was born. That is but one highlight of Fire Pro's SNES run. The series was so successful that there were even opportunities for offshoots, such as Fire Pro Wrestling Queen Special, an all-women wrestling edition of the game back during a time when wrestling was so big that an all-women's wrestling or Joshi Supercard could be held in the frickin' Tokyo Dome. The definitive SNES Fire Pro, however, was 1995's Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium. A big roster with over 100 wrestlers, lots of different modes, the ability to create your own wrestlers. It's a classic game, without a doubt, still one of the best entries in the series. What of us in the West, however? Although no Fire Pro game had made it over here yet, a small amount of people gradually started picking it up. Said people fell into two fairly close together groups. First off, the smart marks of the day, the tape traders and the like, who wanted as much puro risu as possible. It cannot be overstated what a glorious time this was for Japanese wrestling. The crowds were big, and the standard of wrestling was impossibly high, a watermark that I'm not sure has ever been reached again. This was dramatic wrestling, with sports-like presentation, and the best wrestlers giving absolutely everything in every match. It was incredible. Another factor for this interest in Puro for the West was because American wrestling in the early mid-90s was in the doldrums. Interest was way down, there was the steroid trials, the piss-poor characters of the new generation. It wasn't good, and it was reflected in the low quality of American wrestling games back then. And so there's a second group. People who want good wrestling games but aren't getting them from Acclaim are looking at imports, and they're finding out about Fire Pro. Of course, the Venn diagram for wrestling nerds and video game nerds is kinda close to being a circle. I mean that as nice as possible, but these two groups helped Fire Pro to gain a following, albeit a niche one, in the West. As we hit the late 90s, Fire Pro still retains and increases its following. Japanese wrestling is still hot, American wrestling picks back up again thanks to the Monday Night Wars, the Attitude Era and all that, and the internet brings more wrestling fans in touch with what's going on in Japan. Suddenly the likes of Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi start appearing in Pro Wrestling Illustrated's Top 500. However, Human Entertainment were, well, not especially good when it came to managing finance. In 1999 they had debts of over 4 billion yen, and in 2000 they went bankrupt. Fire Pro Wrestling G for the PS1 was their last entry in the series, and the rights to it were transferred to a new company called Spike, formed out of Human's ashes. Fire Pro G is also notable for featuring the debut of a programmer by the name of Tomoyuki Matsumoto, who will become more important later. Despite the change, the quality of the games remained high. Spike also brought the series to the West for the first time, with 2 excellent Fire Pro games for the GBA, as well as making King of Colosseum, a proper 3D spin-off of Fire Pro with official licenses. Other entries such as Fire Pro D for the Dreamcast continued to be popular in the import markets, and then finally we get to Fire Pro Returns, which was billed as the last Fire Pro game. By this time, a series that had started out with just 16 wrestlers now boasted a roster of 327, complete with 500 slots for custom edits. It was, as far as Fire Pro goes, basically flawless. There was a sense perhaps that Fire Pro as a series had nothing left to prove. Still, there are perhaps other reasons why Fire Pro Returns was the last of the series for such a long time. A big reason was that by the mid-2000s, wrestling in Japan was experiencing its own doldrums. The quality of the wrestling was still very good, but commercially it was losing a lot of ground to MMA. The insistence of New Japan icon and madman Antonio Inoki that pro wrestlers were as tough as MMA fighters, to the point of putting leading wrestler Yuji Nagata against Mirko Cro Cop, did not help. It kinda burst any possible myth. When Pride fell spectacularly in 2007 thanks to a Yakuza-based scandal, the interest in combat sports as a whole took a big hit, and wrestling did not benefit. If anything, the situation got worse. Short of New Japan's annual big show in the Tokyo Dome at the start of the year, there wasn't an awful lot of interest. The legendary Mitsuharu Misawa, one of the greatest of all the 90s stars, stayed at the top of his own company, Pro Wrestling Noah, for way longer than he should have just because he was the only real draw, desperate to keep it profitable. He paid the ultimate price for it. It was a very tough time, a period where even some folks in the West were questioning their love of Japanese wrestling, watching people like Misawa die as a consequence of how hard they'd wrestled, even as the crowds got smaller and smaller. This also kinda stemmed a bit from the Benoit murder-suicide case. That's a slight digression, but it's important. Wrestling was down in Japan, indeed it was down everywhere. And when it's down, it's not worth it for a fairly small company like Spike to continue to make wrestling games. Fire Pro Returns felt like an epilogue for Japanese wrestling games in general. In the time between that game and now, only a couple of them have been made by anyone. Of course, a Japanese developer, Yuke's, has made the WWE games for years now, but that's it. Other great names like Aki, famed for virtual pro wrestling as well as the WCW WWE N64 games, also left wrestling behind. It wasn't big anymore. In 2009 there were reports of a new Fire Pro game, Fire Pro Wrestling HD, which would bring it all back. It sounded really frickin' exciting. Unfortunately, the whole thing turned out to be a big hoax constructed by a member of the Fire Pro Club forum because the guy wanted to try and get Spike in gear and show them that people were still interested. It didn't go down well, but it shows how desperate people were. Spike themselves were also perpetually short of cash, meaning that a new Fire Pro game was hardly on their mind. Well, except for that thing with avatars that came out for the 360 and was a massive flop, not related to the series in anything but the name. In 2012, several important things happened. Spike merged with Chunsoft, assuaging their monetary worries somewhat, but still leaving their future somewhat uncertain. And Japanese wrestling slowly started something of a resurgence, led by New Japan. Gradually, more and more people started coming back to it, gates went up across the board, and there's now a tendency for companies to work with others, including those outside of Japan. While the interest for wrestling in Japan may never be what it was back in the 90s, it's certainly on the up, with the quality of the wrestling still being fantastic. and Spike's finances are now a bit more comfortable. And so we get to a place where it's a good time to make a new Fire Pro game, Fire Pro Wrestling World for the PC and PS4. Following the sad passing of Masato Masuda at the way too young age of 48 in 2014, the new leader of the series is Tomoyuki Matsumoto, the man who got his start back near the end of the Human days, with a team of 10 people, roughly as big as a Fire Pro team has always been, working on this new entry. Fire Pro Wrestling World then, a new entry built from the ground up to be the best that Fire Pro has ever been. The game only features around 30 wrestlers out of the box, but that's hardly the pull. What is the pull is that the game has Steam Workshop support, and now we're on PC and we've got hard drives and all that, there are no longer any limits to the amount of edits you can have. You can have as many as you want. And the editing system is as good as ever. There's hundreds of faces to choose from, lots of attires, thousands of moves, lots of skills, and the ability to edit your wrestlers' AI so that they play exactly how you want them to. It's still the best edit system around, just as it was in FPR. And if you don't want to go through the editing process, well, just download them from the workshop. It's so easy, and it even automatically downloads any updates that a creator makes to an edit. In just a week or so of playing, I've already managed to get hundreds of really good edits. A fair few of them are conversions from the earlier games, but there's lots of excellent new work. Chances are anything you want is already available, whether it's the hottest wrestlers around, obscure guys from the Territories era, or, well, an entire roster of wrestlers that have been turned into bears. That's a thing. It's not just the Fire Pro community that have embraced this game with open arms. It seems as though a lot of new people are having fun with it, even those who might not be hugely interested in wrestling, which is a real good sign for this game's future as it continues through early access. It has the same sort of appeal as that of the highly moddable PC fighting game Mugen. You know, the one where characters from just about every fighting game and then some can go against each other, and people bet points on matches on the SaltyBet Twitch channel. Fire Pro could potentially do that too. Of course, that's not to say Fire Pro World isn't the same in-depth simulation of wrestling it's always been. When Fire Pro came up, it was a wrestling game based on timing as opposed to button mashing. When wrestlers come together, there's a lock-up animation. The moment this animation finishes is when you input your move, and the first wrestler to input does the move. It takes a bit to pick up on this moment, but once you do, it becomes locked in, and there's a big mission mode that will teach you everything you need to know about playing the game. The other thing about Fire Pro is that matches play out like wrestling. You have to start with the weak moves such as body slams, arm drags and flying mares before you move on to the medium and then the strong attacks. There's no energy bars, but the state of your opposing wrestler when they're dizzy tells you when you can go for the big moves. As a result of this, Fire Pro works very well as a simulation. When you play a match in Fire Pro, it feels like wrestling. There are periods of offense and downtime on both sides, times when you have to control your breathing and consolidate your stamina, moments of risk and reward, all building up to an end sequence where everyone gets tons of near falls and big moves are hit all over the place before finally someone gets the pin or submission. You don't have to game the system in order to work a good and exciting match in the way that you do when you're playing a more arcade-oriented WWE 2K game. And in the end, it's not about whether you've won the match or lost it. Every match in FPW gets an evaluation at the end, and whether the match was won or not, you'll still get a high rating if the match was good enough. Once you get to grips with the system, amazing things can happen, especially when you get a handle on creating CPU logic and setting up so that, say, wrestlers don't go for basic chin locks near the end of a match, and you use the priority attacks to ensure that wrestlers pin after their finishes and signatures. Fire Pro, weirdly, is almost as fun to watch as it is to play. When two well-made wrestlers go at it in a simulated match, again, it can feel just like watching wrestling. No other wrestling game has ever really managed to do that in the way that Fire Pro has. Simming matches is a large part of the game's appeal. Hell, it's what I do most often when I play Fire Pro, even though I've played the game for years and have long gotten to grips with the timing and all that. It's just so much fun. And of course, the game's presentation has never changed. It's never needed to. Still the same isometric viewpoint that it had in the first incarnation. It looks strange at first, but it works, especially when it comes to things like using the corners and judging the distance between wrestlers. The sprites are like an HD version of Fire Pro Returns, and all those moves are superbly crafted and animated. Is it a spectacular looking game? Well, no, but it doesn't need to be. It has as much pizzazz as it needs, really. And no, it's not all about singles matches either. You can have as many as 8 people in the ring. There's Battle Royals, Survivor Series style elimination, there's a cage match, a couple of special deathmatch types involving barbed wire and landmines, and also some MMA modes. While FPW is predominantly a wrestling game, the MMA action is pretty good here too. There's lots of grappling options, and it's a damn sight better than those god-awful EA UFC games. Fire Pro has the reputation of being a hardcore wrestling sim for hardcore wrestling fans, but it has a lot to offer for anyone who can get to grips with its simple systems and guidelines. Far more open a game than people give it credit for, and once you do that, hell, you can do anything you want. Everything's intergender too, as it is in a lot of wrestling federations these days. Want to see if Asuka can keep her streak going against, say, Cesaro? Go right ahead. Of course, the game is currently in early access, and some people might wonder if it's a bit buggy right now. Honestly, it's not really. There are still some minor bugs in the gameplay and a fair few more features to be added before the game is done. There's the possibility of a matchmaker mode where you essentially create a supercard, being able to use MP3s for a wrestler's entrance and so on, along with constantly adding to the game's arenas and its already impressive selection of moves and faces, but Spike are working pretty quickly so far. There's no current plans for a sequel to this game. The aim here is to create the definitive Fire Pro, and it's worth getting in on the ground floor of that, especially considering that the game you can get right now already has a lot of features, and the action is already very strong. It's like an HD Fire Pro Returns, which is basically as good a thing as I can say. In closing, I have every expectation that Spike will achieve their goal of this being the best that Fire Pro has ever been. They've worked really hard on this one. Where they've usually worked on improving the engine that the game's been built on for nearly 3 decades in the past, this Fire Pro game has been built from scratch, and the added care definitely shows. Everything that's great about Fire Pro is still great here, from the flow of the match to the detail of the edits, and the excitement of that glorious critical. It's a game that I, and a fair few other people, will undoubtedly be playing for a very long time. So if the videos kinda dry up a little after this point, then chances are you know where I am. I mean, geez, I didn't even mention that you can take the game online and work awesome matches with other people, did I? Well, there it is. So, if you've ever loved an entry in this series, or even enjoyed one, if you're pissed off with how stale the WWE 2K games are, if you've got a love for wrestling, then buy this freaking game now. It's Fire Pro, it's 2017, and it's still the champion. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video, then do please like it, do consider subscribing to the channel, and also following me on my Facebook, Twitter, as well as my Patreon, where you can find all sorts of different pledges for you. Anyway, for this video, I would like to thank the following: Adam Schaefer, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sorley, Conformist, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Guatham Blackpool, Guy Middleton, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, John Scott, Josh Jensen, L. O'Brien, Lee Norris, ManagerSim.net, Mark Heslop, Mark Johnston, Mark Whittington, Martin Pataki, Lynette McCrone, Olaf Albeen, Pete Morris, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Potter Margell, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Wyatt Coleman, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Taylor Armand, Leon Natural, Tanya J, Twisted Squote, Vishar D, and Yerka Operator.